Welcome, dear students. In this first video on the Reformation, we are going to look into the period before Martin Luther and his attack on the Catholic Church in 1517, when he came with his 95 Theses against the Church. Martin Luther did not stand alone with his critics at the functioning of the Church. There had been groups criticizing the Catholic Church throughout the late Middle Ages, and by the 15th century, a big part of these complaints came from the humanists. Humanism is part of the Renaissance, which we've discussed in chapter 1. In the Renaissance, people in Europe changed their worldview. They started thinking differently on religion, the position of the humans in the world, and more in general on the world itself. Humanism played an important role in this, as they studied the classical texts from the ancient Greek and Romans and got inspired by Greek philosophers who placed human reason, critical thinking, and looking at nature above mythical and religious explanations of the world. The Renaissance humanists thought that studying these classical texts was very important and also started looking critical at the ancient Christian and biblical texts, where they found that many mistakes had been made in the translations and that the Catholic Church did not follow its own scripture. This led to critics on the excesses of the Church, which, for example, were written down by Erasmus in the praise of folly. Unlike Martin Luther, the humanists did not start their own church, though. They tried to improve the church from the inside. Some points of their complaints were actually the same or similar to what Luther would later write in his 95 Theses. They noted that clergymen were not living a sober and pure life, following the example of Christ, but they were misbehaving, drinking, gambling, actually doing everything which was forbidden. And they also broke their own vow, the vow of celibacy, which means that they shouldn't lay with women, but they did. Many clergymen had a wife and children. And besides that, the church, or at least some clergymen, were greedy, asking way too much of the people, sometimes even more than they could afford. For example, that farmers always had to pay their own part of the harvest, the so-called tithes, even if their harvest had failed. So they would have to starve at that point. But also, they found that priests who actually had to teach the writing, the scripture, the Bible, were uneducated, couldn't read. So how could they read what they had to teach, the Bible? And on top of that, their complaint was that the Vatican and the Pope, the bishops, the whole top of the church was way too consumed with getting worldly power, being as powerful as the king, or even more powerful than the king, or being as powerful as the nobles, instead of focusing on spiritual power, being the guidance in the church. And these critics, even though they were all written in Latin, which meant that only scholars could read them, these critics started spreading all over Europe amongst these scholars who were all focusing on trying to improve the church from the inside. And throughout the 15th and 16th century, these critics, these complaints grew bigger and bigger and bigger, but always inside the church. Which brings us to Luther, who published his 95 Theses in 1517.